Ang librong aming i-review ngayon ay pinamagatang The History of the Philippines by Kathleen, Nadeau, na naipublish noong 2008.
Kathleen M. Nadeau is born on June 30, 1946. She is 74 years old now. Kathleen is a professor of anthropology at California State University in San Bernardino. She is the author of this book, Year 2008, and also the author of Liberation Theology in the Philippines, Faith in a Revolution, Year 2001. She awarded as Independent Publisher Book Award for Psychology Mental Health.
Quick summary muna tayo sa nilalaman ng librong ito. Located in Southeast Asia, the Republic of the Philippines is made up of over 7,000 islands. The first known inhabitants of these tropical islands moved to the Philippines 30,000 years ago on bridges that were now extinct. Since then, the Philippines has undergone major changes due to the large number of inhabitants and colonies from abroad. For hundreds of years, the Philippines came under the leadership of the Spaniards and then the United States. Spanish influence remains a big part of today's Filipino culture. Finally, in 1935, the Philippines began the path to independence. The last century was a post-colonial roller coaster ride for the Philippines. Today, the developing Philippine economy has sparked international interest, and the country has been marked as one of the most promising potential for economic growth worldwide. Basically, it shows the history of the Philippines, a comprehensive account of the Philippines and its struggle to discover or recognize our national identity. This volume is a great addition to any library and perfect for students and general readers. There are 7 chapters in this book, and we're talking about the main idea of each chapter. Chapter 1: Southeast Asian Prehistory and the Philippines. Southeast Asia is a subregion of Asia, consisting of geographical countries in southern China, East India, West Eugenia, and North Australia. The region depends on the intersection of geological plates with a heavy seismic and volcanic activity. Southeast Asia consists of 2 geographical regions. The Southeast Asia, also known as Indochina, comprising Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar or Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam, and the Maritime Southeast Asia, comprising Brunei, Malaysia, East Timor, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. The earliest presence of Homo sapiens in mainland Southeast Asia was traced back to 50,000 years ago and at least 40,000 years ago in maritime Southeast Asia. As early as 10,000 years ago, Hoabinhian settlers developed a tradition and culture of diverse artifacts and tool making. During the Neolithic period, Austroasiatic people lived in Indochina via land routes and seaborne Austronesian immigrants who preferred to settle in maritime Southeast Asia. The earliest agricultural societies that acquired dawa and wet rice emerged around 1700 BCE in the plains and floodplains of Indochina. Chapter 2: Spanish Colonization, 1521 to 1896. Spanish era aims the conversion of the native Filipinos in Christianity. Those who transmitted the Christian faith held in common the otherworldly and future-oriented conceptions of the Bible, while the Filipinos interpreted the scriptures more in a present-oriented and experiential way. Accumulation of wealth by finding trade route, look for spices and desire for great profit is the other aim of the Spaniards. Spices was the most important goods they're looking for all over their voyage. Lastly, to become the most powerful country in the world. Spaniards took the opportunity that native Filipinos were centralized and lacked of unity form of government. They took the opportunity advantage that there is no higher governing institution united the barangay. Moreover, the Spaniards have more knowledge and superior firepower in regards to combat of war. Chapter 3: The Philippine Revolution, 1896 to 1902. The Philippine Revolution formally started when Spaniards learned that revolutionary movement existed. Katipunan was founded by Andres Bonifacio in July 2, 1892, which invite people for common purpose. The Katipunan grew steadily, and one of the objectives of this organization was to fight for independence from Spain. It was the battle cry for freedom that still burns in the hearts of Filipino patriots. On August 26, 1896, the revolution broke out in Cavite. The Filipino outnumbered the Spaniards, but they only have bolos and few rifles. The Spanish had far superior weapon power, but they didn't know how to fight against an enemy who blended in with the local population and who attacked and fought when least expected, especially at night. The Spaniards had indiscriminately rounded up and imprisoned hundreds of men. Many were tortured. The Spanish authorities committed many atrocities and massacres in their desperation to subdue the rebellion. They terrorized the local population in an attempt to instill fear. Chapter 4: American Colonization, 1899 to 1946. This era supposed to provide freedom to the Filipinos. However, soon there were two battles broke out between American and the Filipinos. It is in the reason that the American did not regard to the Moros or Muslims, culture and religion. It was followed the guerrilla war tactics of Emilio Aguinaldo hiding in bamboo thickets and brushes against American. It was also noted that the American were anti-Filipino, leading to upset all the Filipinos. In the aftermath of war, the conditions in the Philippines were devastating. Filipinos suffered severely from epidemics, poverty, famines, droughts, and loss of family members. After battling different imperial powers, the US government was at last restored full independence in the Philippines. Chapter 5: The Philippine Independence, Post-World War II. Philippine politics after World War II evolved from what was a predominantly one-party system during the Commonwealth era to a two-party system. The Nacionalista Party was challenged by the breakaway faction that emerged as the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party brought in new elites who were educated under the Commonwealth and led guerrilla units, which gave them enormous control over local resources and through whom war, reparations, and monies were channeled after the war. Chapter 6: The Marcos Regime, 1965 to 1986. The Marcos government controlled and manipulated the television stations to create false media reports that he was initiating development projects. In the second term of the presidential election, Marcos spent a fortune on posters, billboards, and television advertisements. Marcos blatantly misused public funds to bribe political bosses
into guaranteeing that they would bring in votes from their districts for him, at whatever cost, even through the use of their personal armies, and was controlled the Congress. Marcos used his role to distribute government money like a reward to those who were loyal, while withholding funds from those he perceived to be disloyal. Marcos' regime created a situation where the churches became politically more significant. Most other major institutions, the Congress, the courts, political parties, labor organizations, newspapers, and public broadcasting networks were severely repressed by the military under the Marcos dictatorship. Chapter 7: The Philippines after Marcos. Post-Marcos era, various forces from various leadership maneuvered and faced the Philippines' most pressing problems. The biggest problems were poverty and the collapse of the economy, since Marcos had left the country in shambles. There was also the issue of political strife between the left and the right and the Muslim separatists in Mindanao. Corruption at the highest levels, gambling, and syndication in the police and armed forces, the terrorist organization of Abu Sayyaf, and the restoration of a democratic system of governance had to be addressed in reform was to be successful. In addition, re-engineering and reforms from various sectors was recognized in order to provide proper services to the country.
The Greenwood Histories of the Modern Nation series is intended to provide student and interested laypeople with up-to-date, concise, and analytical histories of many of the nations of the contemporary world. Not since the 1960s has been a systematic attempt to publish a series of national histories, we believe that this series will prove to be a valuable contribution to our understanding of other countries in our increasingly independent world. Over 30 years ago, at the end of the 1960s, the Cold War was an accepted reality of global politics. The process of decolonization was still in progress, the idea of the unified Europe with a single currency was unheard of, and the United States was mired in a war in Vietnam, and the economic boom of Asia was still years in the future.
So when it comes to the author's sources of information, in this book, the author used both primary and secondary sources of information. Every end of the chapters, notes or sources are written randomly. In most books, sources are written in alphabetical order regardless of the origin. Online, books, journals, manuscript, among others. As observed, most of the sources were based on the historical events written by scholars and historians. Some others were extracted from journals and presses. Additionally, the year of publications were from the era of which historical events are present, specifically during 1900s. The skills of the author in extracting this information is highly commendable, as she was able to connect every event of the history. The credibility of the books is acknowledgeable and highly recommended for the use of classroom discussions and the purposes.
The way she describes it, we can say it is very compatible with the topic she chose. Every detail is really thought out and prepared. Every detail is gradually shredded from the beginning to the end. But we think she became biased in the second chapter, which is the Spanish colonization. She only focuses more on resources from Europe than she focuses on resources from the Philippines. She enjoys and favors the work of other countries more than our work.
I would prescribe this book to any individual who knows nothing about the historical background of the Philippines. There were 7 parts adding up to around over 100 pages. The book starts with the pre-memorable occasions when the name Philippines didn't exist. We're only known for having a lot of islands. From Spanish and American colonization,
up until Macapagal Arroyo's administration, the book showcased its different historical events. It's a brief and concise, detailed, and not boring. For me, it absolutely was easy to grasp and extremely informative. However, there are some negative aspects to the present book. There are quite a lot of mistakes in spelling, dates, and years. For example, Osmeña became Osminia. Manuel was sometimes Manual. 1978 and 1968 were often find confusion. In the introductory part, the author claimed that Manila was left more devastated than Warsaw by World War II. On the later part, the author contradicts herself by saying that after Warsaw, Manila was hit worst by World War II. Upon reading of this book, I simultaneously researching the validity in some other trusted online sources. To my disappointment, I caught plenty of plagiarized efforts like copy and paste. For your information, the author writes from a awfully pro-Filipino, anti-colonialist perspective. It's a history book for ordinary people, not for historians.
There's a notable people in Philippine history. Abu Bakar Sultan, Sumatran religious leader who left Palembang for Sulu. After his father-in-law's death, he established his Sultanate Sulu and became its first sultan. Emilio Aguinaldo, President of the First Philippine Republic 1899. He was elected President of the Revolutionary Government at the Tejeros Convention on March 22, 1897, and later Biak na Bato Republic. He was the one who proclaimed Philippine independence at Kawit on June 12, 1898. He also ran against Quezon for the presidency of the Commonwealth in 1935 but lost. Benigno Aquino Jr., Senator and Chief Opposition Leader during the martial law period 1972 to 1981 under President Ferdinand Marcos. Aquino's brutal assassination in 1983 galvanized popular opposition to the Marcos government and brought his widow Corazon Aquino into power. Corazon Cuangco Aquino, Ninoy's widow who became President of the Republic 1986 to 1992. With Salvador Laurel as running mate, she led the opposition that overthrew the authoritarian government of President